let's go back to Trump, because I want to go back to a very interesting back and forth that Alan Dershowitz and Dan Abrams of ABC News and Live PD fame. And he's an accomplished lawyer. I mean, Dan Abrams is a well-regarded, well-respected lawyer. It's just that Live PD pays a lot of money. And people tend to do things they're highly compensated for, whether they are in their sweet spot or not.
Well, I'm sure they didn't expect that to be the huge hit that it has become.
They should have. People like crazy. George Will doesn't watch it, I'm sure. But people like you and I lap it up.
Oh, yeah.
You know, hour after hour after hour. Let's go.
They're doing an 11-day marathon, by the way. Live PD started with, they're doing live shows every night for like 11 days in a row.
I was watching last night, PD Cam.
Yep.
The guy shooting through the window.
See that?
I'm talking about the cops chasing a car, and the car starts firing on him, so he takes his gun out drive the car with one hand. I mean, that's Josie Wales stuff. And shooting through the glass.
Mm-hmm.
Like, wow. Okay. What about these people walking down the sidewalk, man? I mean, what are we going to do? You know, with that? But these guys were bank robbers and murderers. I mean, they're really bad guys. Actually killed one of the guys driving the car. The other fled, but they got him, and he was...
There was an incident in Florence that was on one of the reruns of PD Cam last night.
Look at the rim.
Yeah.
He is in another gear now. Ali, did you see this? He was sleepwalking through Good Morning PD Live 95 until we live PD'd it, and he is into that.
She's
brother.
very energetic right now.
Yeah.
It's impressive.
I like the show.
Let's get out of the gutter. I mean, we're far too sophisticated, bright.
And there's a tie-in here because Dan Abrams is in this next clip we're going to play.
And that was the tie-in. Right. And I allowed you to go down. It's a little bit like me with Springsteen. You know, if you allow me to go down that road, we got an hour's worth of radio
Keep
talking
going.
about
That's
Springsteen.
Right.
So
I noticed you just reeled me back in. So let's get back.
Well, you reeled me in with Springsteen before, so I had to return the favor. Let's go to this week with George Stephanopoulos. Yesterday, ABC News, kind of a back and forth about Trump and collusion.
Laid out by Robert Mueller on obstruction of justice. The special counsel decided he couldn't charge the president, but couldn't clear him either. So the attorney general stepped in, and here's what the president said about that on Friday.
We essentially get a ruling, no obstruction, based on the facts. Our great attorney general made an immediate decision. There was no obstruction.
But that conclusion contradicted even by one of Trump's usual defenders, Judge Andrew Napolitano from Fox News.
When the president asked Corey Lewandowski, his former campaign manager, to get Mueller fired, that's obstruction of justice. When the president asked his then White House counsel to get Mueller fired and then lie about it, that's obstruction of justice. When he asked Don McGahn to go back to the special counsel and change his testimony, that's obstruction of justice. When he dangled a pardon in front of Michael Cohen in order to keep Cohen from testifying against him, that's obstruction of justice.
And our new poll shows a close division. 47% say the president did obstruct justice, 41% say he did not. Let's bring in our legal experts, ABC News Chief Legal Analyst Dan Abrams and Harvard Law School Professor Emeritus Alan Dershowitz. You've written a new take on special counsel's findings and an introduction to the Mueller report. Welcome to you both. And Dan, let me begin with you. It's interesting that the public is divided on this question because if you just look at Mueller's report, it seems kind of equivocal. Do you believe that he, though, was laying out the idea that President Trump obstructed justice?
I don't think there's any question that Robert Mueller believed that the president obstructed justice. So then why wouldn't he have said it? He made it clear in his introduction to the section on obstruction of justice. He said, number one, a sitting president can't be indicted. Number two, we can't even accuse him of a crime in this report because that would be improper. But if we could exonerate him, we would, and we can't. That's it. And then they lay out, and I'm not saying in every single one of the 10 or 11 instances that Mueller believes there was obstruction, but I think certainly with regard to Don McGahn, if you read that carefully.
This idea that he was asked by the president to fire Robert.
And then to lie about it, and then to lie about the conversation. I think it is clear that Robert Mueller, if this were a different situation, would be saying he obstructed justice in the case of Don McGahn.
I agree with that. I think Mueller does believe that. I think he's just dead wrong. In my introduction, I argue, I think very compellingly, that you have to have an actus reus, an act of a crime. And the actus reus of a crime, the act cannot be the exercise of a constitutional authority under Article 2. The president had the authority to fire Comey. Comey said that himself. And the president had the authority to do virtually everything he did.
Mueller takes on that argument directly in his report.
Yeah, and he's wrong. He's wrong. The best analogy, and he does not mention this in this book, and this is an outrage that he doesn't mention it. The most important precedent is the decision by George H.W. Bush to pardon Caspar Weinberger. He did that to stop the investigation. The special prosecutor said he did it to stop the investigation, and yet nobody suggested obstruction of justice because the president has the power to pardon, and the president has the power to fire. So you can't both have the power to do it under the Constitution and that be the act that gives rise to an obstruction of justice.
Just to be clear, Alan's position is a minority position in the legal community.
But it's right.
It may be right, but it's a minority position in the legal community. But let me ask you this, Alan.
Sure.
What about the fact that he, according to the report, is telling McGahn to lie? Right? Is that a little bit different? That's not about firing, right?
Yeah, no, you're right. If he told McGahn to lie to a federal official, that's what Nixon did, and that's Nixon was guilty of obstruction. If there were evidence that the president told a subordinate to lie to a government official.
What if he just said to lie?
No, that's not obstruction of justice. It's not a crime to lie. We'd have no politicians in America.
During an investigation, right, in the course of an investigation, when the media comes sniffing about the McGahn issue, and the president allegedly instructs or asks McGahn to lie, as far as you're concerned, that's okay.
Not as far as I'm concerned, as far as the law is concerned.
No, in terms of your minority position of the interpretation of the law.
My majority position is that the law says it's a crime to lie to an FBI official, it's a crime to lie to a grand jury. Nowhere does it say it's a crime to lie to the media. And under our system of law, unless it's specified as a crime in the statute books, it's not a crime. We don't live in the Soviet Union where unless it's legal, everything is illegal. We live in a country where unless it's specifically illegal, it may be immoral, but it's not illegal to lie to the media.
No, I understand. That's why we have broad laws, right? They're called obstruction of justice.
And they're terrible laws.
You may think
Every terrible libertarian should oppose them.
That's fine. You may think they're terrible, but the notion that there's not a law in the books is nonsense. There is a law in the books, and it's a question of whether it fits into the statute.
The law in the books would criminalize every politician in America today, and it would give too much discretion to prosecutors to pick and choose which lies to go after.
Let me ask if this would extend to the area of high crimes and misdemeanors. I mean, even if you believe that this could not be breaking the law, firing Comey or asking Mueller to be fired, do you believe it is an abuse of power, or, as some have suggested, that it would be showing the president is not faithfully executing the laws, upholding his oath?
That's a fair point, but that's not an impeachable offense. Look, what Bill Clinton did was a crime, but not a high crime, and what President Trump may have done was high, but it wasn't a crime. You need both. You need a high crime. You can't find that in the Mueller report any more than you could have found in the Starr report a high crime against Bill Clinton. It would be a mistake to impeach either of them. The Republicans made that mistake against Clinton. The Democrats, I hope, will not make that mistake against Trump.
Here's the problem when you combine Alan Dershowitz's theory with President Trump's theory, right? Alan Dershowitz's theory is there shouldn't have been a special counsel, and also that you can't obstruct justice if you're the president. Wait, let me finish. Yeah. And you're doing something that you have the power to do, no matter of what the intent is, etc.
You don't get to intent until you get to the act.
So that's Alan Dershowitz's theory. Now you combine that with the president's theory that Congress should not be engaging in oversight, right? These subpoenas shouldn't be valid. None of his people should be complying.
I don't agree with that.
Okay, but I'm saying take the two together, Trump and Dershowitz, and suddenly you have no presidential accountability. None. Zero.
That's why you need to have checks and balances, why it is appropriate for Congress to issue subpoena. But this is a perfect case for checks and balances. The president has the right to oppose the subpoenas, and the courts have the oversight over whether Congress has overreacted. So we're going to see an interesting
blanket stonewalling on all the subpoenas, though, particularly on these questions dealing with the Mueller report. Does that end up constituting another obstructive act?
Absolutely not. He's entitled to do it, and the courts are entitled to strike him down and say, no, you can't do that. Let me tell you what I think the courts are going to do. They're going to look at every subpoena. They're going to say there's no broad opposition to responding to subpoenas. But in this case, maybe Congress went too far. That's what happened during the McCarthy period. The court said Congress went too far. If the courts conclude that the Democrats are using this for partisan advantage rather than for legitimate oversight, then the courts will interfere.
Time is on the president's side.
That's a political issue.
Well, it's a legal issue, right? It's because the courts will take a while to resolve this. And the question becomes enforceability, right? Typically, when Congress believes someone has been, should be held in contempt of Congress, you send to the Department of Justice. You say, hey, Department of Justice, you should enforce this.
Or you can put them in the basement of the the cabinet.
Yes, you can send the old sergeant at arms out. Back in the day, they'd send the sergeant at arms out. That's not going to happen now.
Look, if a court tells the president to comply with a subpoena, he's going to do it. Right now,
on documents and testimony, I'm not so sure.
Well, remember, we do have both the Nixon case and the Clinton case, and the courts do have the power to enforce subpoenas against the president. But they will look at every subpoena and they will see whether or not this was abuse of Congress. We are living through a perfect example of whether our system of checks and balances and separation of powers works.
And if you put Dershowitz and Trump together, there is no such thing.
But you can't put Dershowitz and Trump together because I take a separate position from Trump on this issue.
I want to go back to Abrams and Dershowitz for just a couple of minutes, because I think you were hearing a debate about obstruction of justice or not, and Dershowitz is leaning on the Constitution. Abrams and Stephanopoulos were leaning on Orange Man bad. Orange Man bad.
I used to like Abrams.
Orange Man bad. Well, I mean, you like him because you watched that nutty, unsophisticated hayseed show called Live PD.
True.
But in all honesty, there's a much bigger debate that they're having that they're not really having. And that is Stephanopoulos and Abrams, because they hate Trump and they hate, upheaval in the system and disruption and chaos, to use a word of George Will's. They believe that we're better served by Trump being run out of town and let Washington get back to doing what Washington does. And what Washington has done historically over the past 40 or 50 years is gain control over more and more and more elements of our life. There's a statement that Dershowitz makes about the Soviet Union, and everything is illegal if the founding documents of the country or the government says it's not legal. In other words, we start from a guilty until proven innocent. In other words, if the resolve of the former Soviet Union says you can do it, then it's obvious you can't. And the Constitution is very different than that. And that's the highlight Dershowitz is trying to make. It's not to get Trump. It's the last thing that we should think about doing is getting somebody with the federal government, but we've conditioned a certain universe of people into believing that's what they have the authority to do. That's what they're supposed to do. The federal government has become incredibly powerful, almost all-consuming, and threatening to a large number of Americans, and that's the way it needs to be. We need people afraid of government. If we let Trump do things that may be constitutional but not right, and if we don't use the power of our government to teach him a lesson, then what sort of country will we have? I'll tell you what kind of country we'll have. We'll have the kind of country that Adams, Washington, Madison, Jefferson wanted us to have. That's the kind of country we'll have. Abrams doesn't want us to have the kind of country that Adams and Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison and Washington and Franklin wanted us to have. Stephanopoulos does not want that kind of country. The Bernie Sanders supporter does not want that kind of country. Barack Obama supporters don't want that kind of country. They want a kind of country where government orchestrates and organizes every facet, and we become robotic figures, and we just kind of meander around, conforming to every whim and policy the government dictates. That's what liberals want. Liberals want government in charge of more and more and more and more aspects of our daily lives. And I hope with all my heart that there's enough of us who don't. And not only enough of us who don't and are willing to stand up against that. Because Abrams is saying there's another interpretation, Alan. There's another one. I know you constitutionalists. And I know how in love y'all are with that crazy document that was written 200 some odd years ago. But there's another day here, Alan. Professor Emeritus, you're older and you're romancing about these days. But we've got to let government settle every score. You see, I mean, you just hear it in his voice. And Stephanopoulos, the moderator, I mean, he's really a Dershowitz antagonizer in this particular case. He jumps in. So liberals are showing you exactly where they are in this Trump scenario. It's not about obstruction. It's not about collusion. It's not about constitutionality. It's about what kind of country do you want to live? Do you want to live in a country where you have a right unless the government forbids it, or do you want to live in a country that the government dictates what you can and can't do? Because that's kind of where we're headed. That is the great debate in America today. And that's what liberals want. Liberals make no bones about it. And there's a little bit of I don't know, a little bit of respect I have for those who believe, like Bernie Sanders, free college, free health care, free everything. We're going to put government in control of every single thing we could possibly ever put government in control of, and you're just going to have to deal with it.